Welcome back. Please hit subscribe, hit the notifications bell, leave a comment if that's what you desire. Go to our About section, Dutch Hunter Rendezvous shirts, Legend Superstition Mountain shirts, short sleeve, long sleeve, black and gray. Pick one up. Rendezvous coming up the 5th, 6th, 7th of November at the Dons Camp. And I think that's kind of all the news for now of everything coming up. But there's other things we'll be kind of pushing on and touching upon as they get announced here in the future. But this week we want to delve back into do the historical side of things, kind of weaving the story and kind of shooting from the hip on this one a little bit. But it's one of those more confusing, well-known stories to some degree, and people love to quote stuff from it, but they really don't know the story, and they generally pull all their information off of one book in particular. This book was basically compiled by Thomas Glover, good friend of all of ours. The Lost Dutchman Mine, Jacob Waltz, Part 2, the Holmes manuscript, and I don't know if it should be available. I think you can still pick this up reasonably out there. I don't know if he's still publishing it, but I think there's still copies. I've still seen them around. Interesting book. It was a manuscript that supposedly was written between a guy ghostwriting and working with Brownie Holmes. Brownie sometimes would deny he did it, other times admit he did it. We believe he was trying to put something together. For the most part, it's actually about Brownie Holmes' actual searches in the mountains. And that's actually a lot of fun information, a lot of great backstory. I love that kind of thing. And that's the part I enjoy the most about it. The early part is the Jacob Waltz story, as told by Dick Holmes to Brownie Holmes, which is supposedly, according to the manuscript, it was like the first time anybody actually heard the truth and all that, which isn't really honest and truthful there. And that's what we'll touch upon, and we'll touch a little bit on the story, and then we'll touch upon some of the issues and problems with the story and other variations and versions out there. Now, the gist, as most people would get, is that Jacob Waltz, after the whole Salt River flooding the banks of the Great Flood, he's been laid up in Julia Thomas's house for about 7-8 months. Or her store, or depending which version of the Holmes story you actually listen to, because there's multiple versions of this thing. And oddly enough, the Holmes manuscript by Brownie is a second-hand person telling of the story, but Dick Holmes tells a very different story to the newspapers at times, and as well did it Ida Holmes. So Brownie wasn't even there, and yet we got to take his story verbatim. But basically, Dick Holmes' story is whether Waltz is in the back of Julia's store, or some outbuilding behind the store, or he's at Julia's house, or in some outbuilding behind her house. Whichever, take your pick, because they're all Dick Holmes' version of the story. Okay, remember that. All those are actually from Dick Holmes. But needless to say, he's walking along, and the other problem we have is Ida Holmes says she was with Dick Holmes. There's interviews where she says she was there. She came out of the house with him. They went over. They sent Julia to go fetch the doctor, which seems like really a nice thing to do as neighbors. Is that why don't you go get the doctor? We'll sit with Mr. Waltz. I'm not quite sure how that will work or whatever. But anyways, Dick Holmes sat with him alone, which Dick Holmes said repeatedly. But then later Ida said she was with him and went over and actually verified what happened. And then later in the Holmes manuscript, Brownie says Gideon Roberts was walking with Dick Holmes, and then he died within the year. So we have 3 different variations of who or what or sat with Jacob Waltz at that time. Remember, this is the official version, because no matter what you say is in the Holmes manuscript, that's Brownie Holmes recounting of the tale, and I'm going by newspaper articles and stuff where Dick Holmes and Ida Holmes speak. Now, we can say Ida Holmes was just kind of working herself in the story, but if Dick Holmes says he was the only person that sat with Waltz and leaves Gideon Roberts out and goes into this other stuff, then what can we say? So the Holmes manuscript version is, I think, Waltz is at Julia's store. Some of the original versions was Dick Holmes lived across the street, which he didn't live across the street. But then they came out because Julia was out in the street yelling, and they went in. I guess it was a better version to have her run out from the store while they were walking at 6 a.m. in the morning past her place. I don't know. So that's the kind of the gist, and then Julia runs off to the doctor's to fetch the doctor, and then Dick Holmes by himself, or with Gideon Roberts, or with his wife Ida, goes to sit down with Waltz. And then Waltz, who we kind of like, you get a little bit of everything. Waltz spoke very fluent English. Waltz spoke broken English. Waltz spoke primarily German. We have to remember most everyone he dealt with in everyday life spoke German, and Julia and Reinhardt, who we know actually knew him and spent significant time, said he preferred to seem to speak in German, and he spoke quite often in German to them, and which was one of the problems with some of the clues and some of the translations of things. So Waltz is sitting there, and he's dying, and he can barely breathe, and he's gasping and dying, and suddenly he has very clear, strong English, which people say sometimes dying people speak really well. They also suddenly can speak a second language extremely well. And you can see where I'm going with this is because it kind of gets ridiculous, because Waltz decides to tell the entire Lost Dutchman story and let Dick Holmes know he's leaving him the gold ore under his bed and the mine and everything else with it, because Dick Holmes, who Herman Patrasche actually in the only time in an interview he mentions is said the only time Dick Holmes ever met Waltz was in the hereafter, and he laughed. He didn't do it mean, vindictive, or anything like that. He basically said he considered the whole Dick Holmes story a joke. This is the person that helped Julia Thomas care for Waltz and was around at that time. Now, according to the Dick Holmes story, Reinhardt is either out drunk, missing just completely, or drunk in the hallway and passed out. We're not quite sure what, because Jim Bark, Sim Zealy, and most everybody else doesn't touch upon the morning, because they don't need confirmation he died. He died, and he knew Julia Thomas and Herman Patrasche. But of course, Dick Holmes is kind of in this whole mode of like he's got to work himself in there. So he had followed Waltz, and Waltz knew him well and really liked him and all this stuff. And it kind of becomes kind of a BS story, especially when you realize that during this whole deathbed confession, Waltz also says, he couldn't file a claim. He's not a naturalized citizen, which he was a naturalized citizen. We know this. We know Waltz knew. He applied for it, not just Mississippi, but he was granted it in Los Angeles County and had his papers with him. So again, it's kind of this curious thing is what Holmes didn't know, he didn't leave out of his story. But it always gets a little more curious. So Dick Holmes is with them, and Waltz does all this stuff. And we know the gist. I mean, you can say the clues, whatever, and this and that. I consider it a little bit of kind of like tall tale telling. There's a book called Arizona Cowboys, and it came out in the 30s, but it was sometime around the early 1900s, 1903, 1904, in that era. The gentleman who wrote it, and I have a copy of it here, Dane Coolidge, interviewed and took photographs of the various cowboys working around the area in Superior and the Superstition Mountains and Fort Peaks area. And there's a guy, Johnny Jones, in this book, and he recounts the Lost Dutchman story as he knows it. Well, this is early turn of the century, and he's telling a very odd Dick Holmes story where Dick Holmes and there's a Mexican named Rodriguez, and Holmes and Waltz get together, and they're trying to get Rodriguez drunk to steal the map for the mine off of him. And it's a completely tall tale, but it also integrates Dick Holmes, who was already flapping his gums publicly, obviously. So the whole idea that Dick Holmes was doing all this secretly and nobody really knew he had all these clues, it appears Dick Holmes was telling plenty of people. Not only that, but you start finding newspaper articles where every time someone dies or something happens to the superstitions, in the early 1900s, Dick Holmes' names keep showing up, especially after Julia Thomas has passed away and Herman Patrasche had left town. So there's no witnesses to correct him anything, so everybody's going to Dick Holmes for their information. And Dick Holmes probably became something of a celebrity as far as the expert on the Lost Dutchman Mine. It gets curious, though, because while, you do read a number of books and stuff, there is this manuscript. It's called Rainbow's Inn. It's by a gentleman by the name of Milton Rose. Milton was kind of an odd individual. He did a lot of research and stuff, and it's not a very thick manuscript and whatnot. But his whole point is it was a whole different group of people, and Holmes wasn't really too involved in all this, and Holmes wasn't even there. He claims Holmes was in Montana, but then there's other people that point out newspaper articles show him he was at one of his mines during the time and hadn't been in town. There's a lot of things about that, which gets us to the point of supposedly he stole or took or was given the gold ore, and then he left with it, and then Julia Thomas couldn't find it, and this whole thing, and there's a big, big deal about all that. And there was a gentleman once claimed on this big thing about the court case and all this stuff and all. Well, nobody's ever come up with the court case papers. He probably will eventually someday when he compiles them himself, which I don't really have a problem with calling him on this stuff at this point, because he's done it before and he will continue to do it. In Milton Roses, he spoke to a number of eyewitnesses or people from that current time, and the individuals that supposedly Julia thought took it didn't take it, and they went to the Justice of Peace. Dick Holmes' name is not mentioned in any of this. Reinhard Patrasche says at the time, and I believe it was when he talked to Barry Storm, said basically that the gold under the bed in the candle box or whatever it is, but it's supposed to be a candle box, that gold was for Julia, for caring for Waltz, taking care of him and continuing to care for him. If they got to the camp and got the rest of the stuff and were able to make that trip, then they would all share in that. Now, Reinhard Patrasche had helped bail Julia out because to protect her assets, she'd signed most everything over to Reinhard at one time until she dug herself out. Waltz helped her out. She was able to get off of under all her debts. But at one point, Patrasche was pretty in there, pretty tight and pretty close too. He was kind of that guy that you sign all your stuff to keep it safe. So when everybody else is going after you for your debts, you don't lose everything. And those papers are in the Maricopa County Recorder's office, so you can see what was going on, the juggling there. It's kind of a curious thing, but Dick Holmes goes further to kind of, through his storytelling and newspaper articles and so forth, to kind of cause more grief and damage to his story, possibly even having slightest amount of truth. Now, in no way I ever hold Brownie Holmes kind of something about it. It's his dad. So if his dad told him this stuff and he really wanted to believe his dad, you can't say nothing. You can't hold Clay worse to it, because Clay was friends with Brownie and they were close, and Brownie didn't lie to Clay, I'm sure, certainly. So, but kind of the problems that start to happen is like, Dick Holmes said he rescued Waltz from his house during the flood. Well, we know pretty well that it was Reinhard Patrasche, and Patrasche had brought Waltz back and got him back to Julia's house. And that's been corroborated in a number of different ways, but the problem is Reinhardt was there when Waltz was buried. He helped make the coffin. The burial site that Waltz was buried in is next to Reinhardt's brother, so George Patrasche. So we know Reinhardt's very connected into this. Well, Brownie Holmes said his father Dick took him out and showed him where they buried Waltz, because he was also at the funeral. So not only did he save Waltz from the adobe house and brought him in town and saved his life, which is why Waltz gave him the gold, right? Is that he also was there for the burial and knew where Waltz was buried and all this stuff. And one of the problems is it wasn't the right spot. And then people said later, tried to make excuses again, like, well, maybe he forgot and all, but it was actually through the cemetery records they were actually able to figure out where Waltz is actually buried, which is where he's buried kind of basically to this day. We know in that vicinity next to George Patrasche, that's what Herman said, and Reinhardt said he's buried next to our brother George Patrasche. So you keep running into these things about Waltz not being a naturalized citizen. Brownie really probably didn't know Julia Thomas that well, probably briefly might have known her before she passed away, and something of them. It was just kind of like, I'm never going to fault Brownie on it. For he told a great tale, and like I said, the second half of his book is what I read it for. But the Dick Holmes story, it's like a bucket full of a ton of holes. And you're trying to say, if all this stuff is false, if it's not real, if it's not even documentation, it's just garbage, well, what are we supposed to believe out of it? So, again, we got the Rainbow's End and the Arizona Cowboys, and we got these various different stories and things, and, and these different people involved, and pretty much it appears that, Ely and Bark and a lot of people, Barry Storm, they left the Waltz death story because it probably was Waltz was just very ill. They didn't expect him to die. He probably was very ill that morning. They got a doctor. He was possibly even dead before the doctor got there, most likely, which is what it sounds like in the manuscripts that we read. And then he was buried either that same day or the following day. Some people say it was that same day, but the newspaper accounts say it was the following day. some of it doesn't really matter, because the problem with the Dick Holmes story starts and begins and ends at each newspaper article is a different version. Now, you can't say, well, that's a lie, because, well, it was Dick Holmes. If Dick Holmes is the interview subject and he's telling them something, and it's not Gideon Roberts or Ida Roberts, it's not Charles Roberts or any of these other people that are mentioned, because there is an individual, Charles Roberts, supposedly involved too. But if he's mentioning different variation things and he's saying, well, it was me by myself, and then Ida later says, well, I was with him to try to verify the story, then Brownie says, no, it's Gideon Roberts who died shortly thereafter and never told anybody, we have a bit of a problem of just kind of saying, okay, chronologically, now the story works. Now, what I've always believed, as more information came out after Reinhardt left, which was very early on, and then Julia kind of became kind of disconnected from it more and more. Well, Dick Holmes was a grocerman, and he's, well known, and I'm sure he was telling stories and sitting there and talking. And he had a wife, he married one of the Roberts, divorcees, Ida Roberts. She'd been married into the Roberts family, divorced, and then her, and I think her son's Jesse. She had a son. He had an older stepson who committed suicide or was accidentally shot many years later. And then they had Brownie. And I'm sure he was probably seen around town as kind of a guy of kind of middle class, good character, so forth. And he started telling the story. And since he's from that time period and there's less and less people around, he was quite young during that time period, it could be. And then we always run into the problem of like, well, he suddenly seemed to have some money. Well, we also forget his father, who was Richard Holmes Sr., or the second, and Dick Holmes, as we know him, might have been the third. Richard Holmes Sr. actually did pretty well, and he invested in cattle and horses and stuff, and he seemed to be working and have some dealings. You can go into the Maricopa County Recorder's material and find that he had some dealings and worked with his son Dick Holmes, who was married and had a new son. And I'm sure when you have a dad that has money and is investing and speculating in these things, it kind of plays your way. He also had, I believe it was opal mines, but he had some mines that he was working on. They weren't literally playing out. But then there's an odd newspaper article which talks at some point in the 1890s that, and this is after Waltz has died and has given him all his gold, that Dick Holmes' opal mine or whatever seems to have hit, and it's talking about how things are going well and everything, and that he can quit his job as a dishwasher. So now suddenly the guy that had all this money and bought this house and was well-to-do and everything and was searching for the Lost Dutchman Mine, we find out he was working as a dishwasher because maybe things weren't going as well, which is pretty typical during those times. So did he have the money? Did he actually was the matchbox or anything? How well was it connected to him? How well was he connected? Was he the person that worked with Julia to help have the ore sold? How involved was he? Did he go by the day after Waltz was dead and picked up enough information that he was able to fill in a lot of holes, which a lot of people were. Now, a lot of people didn't tell other people about what they found out from Julia. Dick Holmes seemed to like to talk, and that could have been the other stretch there. So the Dick Holmes story is very mysterious, because if you go by the Holmes manuscript and you actually try to run it by as an actual historical document, it completely fails all across the board. If you take the other documents, they seem to get all over the place. Milton Rose interviewed a lot of people from the time period that actually had met Waltz, knew Waltz. He did a lot of interviews. Whether these people were entirely honest or not, it's all, you can speculate on that. But he did his due diligence and a lot of good solid research. Now, the problem into that is, as Dick Holmes spoke, then Reinhardt Patrasche is out of the picture. Herman Patrasche, literally whatever he heard too as a storyteller would integrate. So as Dick Holmes is integrating other material and things from other things, is like, well, Waltz died here, Waltz died there, Waltz is buried here, Waltz is buried there. Herman Patrasche started to do the same thing as he got older. His area of focus, where he thought the Dutchman was, always remained the same. No matter what anyone speculates, it's actually Bob Garman's book is an excellent resource for it, because where you see Bob Garman searching for the Dutchman for Herman, you will find also in other people's diaries and books and journals, it was the same area. Herman searched generally the same kind of basic area for the most part. Now, he did go explore other areas. but he was honed into one particular area for the most part. And it's because of things he found. One of his partners early on in the 20s and the 30s was George Colomborn, who was Tom Colomborn's dad. He also worked with Sims Ely and Jim Bark searching for the mine. He worked for a lot of different people, including the Martin family, but also as the Barclays. And he was kind of a laborer, kind of odd hand. He worked as a cook and different things. And there's a lot of stories. There's a lot of books that kind of reference some of the backstory. It's a shame that even with Bob Garman, no one ever tried to put a good detailed history of Herman and all the people he worked with and the searches he did, because it's kind of a little bit all over the place. But he also, while he did spend some time with his dad and his brother and Julia early on, him and Reinhardt still did actually search for the Lost Dutchman Mine for many, many years, until I think Reinhardt being out in Globe in that area, it just became too difficult. But Reinhardt would come in from Globe, they would hook up, and the two of them would actually go search for the mine still together. And this is in the 10s and the teens and getting into the 20s. So what is the bottom end of it all? The problem becomes is you start looking at a book and you take one book and say, well, this is the Holmes manuscript. Brownie Holmes wrote it, so it was from his dad. But then you find out there's documented pieces of information in there that are just absolutely not true. In fact, Waltz's nephew's name is different in every book that mentions him. They use a different given name for him. And they come up with different things. The man who found the skull that had the hole in Waltz's nephew, it's not the chain around the neck story. It's a whole different person, and I can't remember offhand what the boy's name is at that point, but there's a whole story on that, and he found and supposedly at that point, I think that story, the boy was named after Waltz. So it's not the Peter Backen story we read in another thing. It's his name was Jacob Waltz too, Jake. And so it's kind of, all these stories can correlate, but it's like, okay, if did somebody just have a skull that had a gunshot through it and it just became this different person all the time, just somehow attached to Waltz? Which another problem is Waltz is known as Waltz, but also he's known as Jacob Miller, which became the Jacob Miller and Waltz story and how they got intertangled and intermixed. And this is really early in the 1900s, so even by the time the stories were published in the newspaper that we think confused it later, those stories were already becoming confused. And it had to be that there was someone else with a name and people couldn't get the name straight. And in fact, if you go back to the newspaper articles, Gregory Davis did a great job of early periodical newspaper articles and putting those together. It's available at the museum. It kind of gives you kind of a bit of insight of how this thing became such a mess as time came on. And when you look at it, you'll find out that you understand why, it's not, you can't sit there and point a finger at Brownie Holmes and say, well, he's lying. I think he was just listening to everything that was told to him by his dad and then trying to put together other information he heard and he thought had to be true. And Julia Thomas wasn't a 300-pound, dark, black as night woman who was Jacob Waltz's caretaker or maid that he hired to care for him. I mean, that whole thing has to be just pushed out of the thing. She was a successful businesswoman. That's in the actual newspapers of the time and the recorder's office. So it's kind of odd of how those type of things got out there as these people disappeared. Her business was gone in the 1890s, I mean. So basically 10, 15, 20 years later, you can just literally, well, she's dead. You can say whatever you want. And people that probably knew her just probably called BS, but nobody's listening to them because now it's become a fancified tale and fable and myth, and it just blows beyond everything. And it's unfortunate because you look at those newspaper articles, they don't get her name right, they don't get Jacob Waltz's name right, they get almost nothing right in the earlier articles. They were all over the place. P.C. Bicknell went over and talked to Julia and a couple other people. I think that one of the gentlemen that supposedly knew Waltz and was one of the early searchers was a man named David Carr. I think it was David Carr. But all these people, it just didn't connect very well because they were running in, getting information, trying to go look for the mine. And then things kind of died out a little on it. I think there was other gold discoveries and other things happening, and then the mine started coming back up. Julia did her searches. One of the criticisms of Milton Rose is that Bark and Ely didn't mention that she was married to Albert Schaefer. Well, that came after all this and after they'd met with Julia. So it is a bit odd. I never have a problem with listening to the Dick Holmes stories. always have a problem with about the 75% of it that's fabrication of it. So did Dick Holmes actually ever meet Jacob Waltz? Well, in Barry Storm, if you get Thunder God's Gold, the original first edition, it has the notes of authenticity in the back. Reinhard Patrasche says no, didn't meet him in this lifetime. They met in the hereafter. There was a number of other people that said so. Holmes seemed to go to great lengths to try to prove out the fact that he met Waltz, but most of the people were very dismissive. At no time was Herman or Reinhard ever interested in ever speaking to Brownie Holmes while they were searching. They were not interested in any way with Dick Holmes. There's some stuff that Barkenelian letters talked about. Maybe we should go back and look at some of the Holmes stuff and see if there was anything to it. People took that as like, oh, well, they suddenly realized. Well, no, it kind of comes more off as speculative of what could have he picked up. We don't really know. But the odd thing is, they interviewed Julia and Reinhardt quite frequently. That was Jim Bark. Sim Zealy, I don't think he ever spoke to Reinhardt, but he spoke to Julia quite frequently. From all these interviews and the information they had from them, there was not really any information pertaining to Dick Holmes, and unfortunately for that, we don't have any papers or anything that show anything otherwise. So it's kind of Dick Holmes' story against the world. And the problem, the flaw is he didn't know where he was buried. He really didn't go. He kept kind of coming up with things to try to reinforce his story. And what tells me as a researcher is when you're throwing everything in the kitchen sink in to try to reinforce your story, that no, my story is real because of this, it tends to tell me you don't really have the story that you're trying to tell us. And that's disappointing for a lot of people, because for many, many years there was the Patrasche Thomas group and the Dick Holmes group. Well, the Dick Holmes group kind of were the Brownie group, and you can't fault them because they had what Brownie told them, and Brownie was not lying. Brownie was telling them the truth as he knew it, which is always important for me to make sure people understand that, is Brownie and Clay are going to tell the story that they knew the truth of what they were told. So in the end, it kind of throws a lot of people off, but what it does is the Dick Holmes story starts to merge and migrate, and then there's the people that have it that may, and I don't know why the Thomas Patrasche groups can be bad enough about trying to tweak clues and do things with them. There are a number of people on the, and definitely, I'm not in any way throwing Clay or Brownie or anybody like that in this group, but there are people that will literally make stuff up. They will type stuff up and say this came from an original manuscript or do this or that, and literally make crap up. And they do it to try to push this narrative. And then what happens is the two stories start kind of getting too mixed up, because there's a face of rock, a face in a rock, and this rock, and it's like the Holmes version is like this fancified storytelling version compared to the Julia Thomas, which is basically he says there's this, he says there's this, he says there's this. And the problem becomes, once the stories intertwine, you got to work really hard to kind of break those things loose. I have a tendency in myself at times to sit there and have to go through my head and wind it back and understand, is this actually a Dick Holmes thing, or is this a Patrasche Thomas thing? And it's very important to have the bark notes, because you can go through and kind of sort and separate some of that stuff out. Because it's important, because once you start going around the wrong dog leg, you're done. You're way off, and you're looking for something that isn't real. Are there going to be a few people that are going to argue with me on this? I don't really care, because the documentation's there. If Dick Holmes is saying that Waltz said he was not a naturalized citizen, and Waltz had the papers and had to kind of know he was because he applied for it twice and was granted it finally, there's just too much there that just makes you say he didn't know Waltz as much as he wanted to. When you're trying to make it go over the top of how well you knew someone because of what you know, it's because of something completely different. We aren't there anymore. We don't even know how any of this transpired. We know Julia Thomas was with Waltz. We know Reinhard Patrasche was. We know Reinhard Patrasche was very involved in this stuff. We know Herman and Godfrey Patrasche heard this stuff from Julia Thomas and Reinhard Patrasche, as did Jim Bark and Sim Zealy, and Barry Storm to some extent. And the problem becomes is whenever dealing with Holmes and them, I think that's the reason Barry Storm and a lot of people really got turned off of these guys, and you'll find a lot of the early stories and manuscripts left Dick Holmes out, because I think they found the BS meter was there. And they probably were able to talk to people in real time who were there, who were able to say, he didn't live nowhere near there. He didn't start telling that story till years later. Unfortunately, once someone heard, oh, okay, I'll just forget about it, and then they just moved on. They didn't make notes and say, okay, we talked to so-and-so and so-and-so. They did not do this. No one sat down with Reinhard Patrasche and Julia Thomas and asked them about a number of things that Waltz told them, because Waltz would talk to them for hours. And it wasn't just about where the Lost Dutchman Mine is. He talked about his life. And they probably knew quite a bit about him. And yet no one at the time, they were all interested in finding the mine and the clues to the mine. They were not interested in Jacob Waltz that we would kind of like to know, the information that might help us today. One of those interesting stories, too, is that, you get all these outside stories. Milton Rose's manuscript carries some of those. Jim Bark's notes has some of them, and you get to add them in and compile them in. It would be nice to have a book compiled with all these anecdotes about Waltz. But one of the ones is someone was trying to get a hold of Waltz's sister, and Julia Thomas said that Waltz left her, the address and stuff, because he actually corresponded with her and wanted Julia to contact her and let her know in case he died, that he had died and all this. And Julia told whoever that was, I'm trying to remember, it's not on the tip of my tongue right now, but she told them, I have the address somewhere and I'll try to find it for you. And she didn't, and they never got the address from her. People, I think, looked up the people later, and they found, since they didn't really know much, that the 2-3 generations later didn't know anything about the story. They left them alone and did not make them publicly known, because I think Tom Collenborn once told me is, those people have no clue what anybody's talking. They don't really care, and it just becomes very weird to them that people are coming out of the woodwork and trying to tell them, oh, we know where your great-grandfather or your great-uncle's mine is. These people have no attachment to it and don't really care. But Julia said she had, so Julia had a lot more inside information, but no one bothers to ask. Now, supposedly Julia at that point, and we'll get into some time, Julia's like flipping out and doing all kind of voodoo crazy stuff and all this. But she also was sitting there giving very rational interviews to a number of different people. And she was giving them information and saying, yes, Waltz has, he has a sister here and he has family there and this and that and everything else. So Julia probably was a great repository for knowledge for all of us. And we just lost it because everybody was interested in the mine. Yes, but what about the mine, Julia? And I think it was the Howlands that got that information. Ray and Lizzie Howland got that information off her. I could be wrong, but I thought it might have been them. So that was the rather entertaining and speedy way to go around the Dick Holmes story. I never met Brownie Holmes that I know of. I don't think we ever crossed paths. We could have, but I don't think I knew him. I don't think I did. I've seen a few pictures from him. Nothing sparks any familiarity, but of course, then again, when you're a very young man, everybody kind of looks the same at that time of period. I think I would have recognized him or known something, or someone would have said something. So I don't think I ever encountered him in any shape or form or way. I've heard a lot what Clay did. I believe they had a very good friendship towards the end of Brownie's life, and I respect that very, very much. Clay's a wonderful guy, and it sounds like they had a lot in common, and whatever they got out of that friendship, that's a great thing. It'd be great for Clay just to write a book about their talks and stuff, not about the Lost Dutchman Mine, but just about their time and their friendship together. I love those books. Those are my favorite books of all. Ron Feldman's little autobiography, I enjoyed that, maybe more than I should have, because I know a lot of the people involved in the book, but it was very interesting to hear about Ron's life and his brother and everything else, and there's a big gap in there where things suddenly jump forward. But it was great hearing that and the stuff about him and Brian Lichtman, and knowing both Ron and Brian and a lot of particulars in the book. It was great. I like those kind of books because they talk about their searches, but you kind of get the sense of friendship and partnership and stuff that went on. And I think that's a big part of all this in the end. It's all said and done. What do you think? I know it's hard to pick this stuff up. Rainbow's in. I know the museum used to carry them. I don't know if they do. Arizona Cowboys is still out there available and republished. It's better to find a copy in the library and basically copy off those 3-4 pages, because most of the book, it's a kind of an interesting book. So if you like hearing about what was going on with Pancho Monroy and a lot of these other guys working cattle and sheep and stuff, it's kind of a cool book. I enjoyed the book overall for history of the area. The Holmes manuscript, picked that up from Thomas Glover. Definitely entertaining and some great stuff Brownie Holmes had to talk about in his searches of the people he met. Dr. Thomas's Glover, The Golden Dream, Lost Dutchman Mine, Part 1. That book also has a bunch of good information and stuff. Curse of the Dutchman Mine by Helen Corbin, even though I don't think Dick Holmes even makes much of a notice in there. So depending on the book you read is how much you get. I think once people realized there was not a lot of Dick Holmes information, that was substantiated if they were looking for documented stuff, which Helen Corbin really seemed to hold to. That is what she thought was good documentation, to hold that to her books. And that was one of the reasons I liked The Curse of the Dutchman. Now, there was the bigger expanded Bible later, but I really liked The Curse of the Dutchman's Gold. I thought that was a really excellent book. I actually cherish my signed copy. I'll say autograph, but it was my signed copy from her. Because that book really kind of put me back kind of into thinking, maybe there is something to all this stuff. And being able to take all my time in the mountains and the stories I heard and take that book and start trying to relate everything and parallel things and see what I knew. So, but pick up some of these books, any book you pick. And I guarantee you, as you pick up, if you build a collection of these things, you're going to find that Holmes story is bouncing off the walls every which way. And then you're going to start going into the recorder's office documents and stuff and finding nothing really works. It doesn't connect. I know a number of guys really tried to pull this thing together, and it's almost impossible. It's literally just a complete yarn tangle of stuff. And unfortunately, it needs so much of it excised. It needs cut away from it because so much of it is probably just fat, non-truth. And, and you know what? You can always say this. It doesn't always mean it's a lie. It can be just a non-truth or an untruth. And it doesn't mean the guy's lying. The guy just might not know and just be putting bad information out there. So a little controversial, but I don't think it really is, because I basically run by not even the wheat and chaff stuff that Bark speaks of, but I work off of basically what I consider black and white of this type of information. So there it is. Regardless of what you think one way or the other, do your own research, and do more research than pick up 2 books and say, well, I picked up Thomas Glover's 2 books and, I think you're wrong, Wayne. Well, you need to pick up a few more books, because if you're not looking at something on both sides of that coin, like I've said before, if you're not looking at all the available information, which there is tons, you're not looking much at all. That being said, that was this week. We'll find another little exciting piece of historical narrative to kind of spin and put in the dryer and kind of get it all dried out and pull it out and look at what it looks like. From myself and from all the other Dutch hunters that sit back and kind of enjoy the stuff and are waiting, because we have a rainy day outside. And I don't think it's even getting past 85 degrees, which means treasure hunting season's coming. So we're finally getting out of the summer, and we're going to get back out there. And I know I'm excited. I hope Frank is. Maybe Frank's not so excited, but I'm excited because I've been missing it, and I've been waiting to get back out there. So we will be getting back out there. Thank you for joining us on Chasing Legends. Until the next time, I'm Wayne Tuttle. You're not, and take care.